effects the Black Power movement had on the wider society, in particular on the economic development trajectory that we took from that period in the 70s up until about the mid-80s. And so why would I want to discuss social movements as a case? Because I think in recent times we're seeing a sort of resurgence, I think, of social movements in global political economy. And social movements, they're rising up to challenge what I think are some sort of orthodox ideas, thinking, and essentially an unfair economic system. And they intend more or less to stake a claim about what is possible beyond what we've known at least for the past 40 years, given the rise of neoliberalism. And I think there is a larger cause in that's happening. There's a trend that's happening globally with the rise of demagogues, with the rise of populist figures. I think it's happening both in what we might consider the global north, I guess, with the prominent figure of Donald Trump, as well as the shift towards, I guess, Great Britain sort of exiting the European Union, a number of places in Europe, and Turkey, we have Hungary. We also have this particular phenomenon happening in the global south, with Brazil, in the Philippines. So a lot of people after 40 years of the decline of wages among workers that has happened in both realms, in the north and in the south. And the fall in living standards that have happened, where work has become a lot more precarious and based on a survivalist kind of mentality. People are rising up and saying that, okay, perhaps we have had enough. So we've seen, I think, the sort of early manifestation of social movements that we saw, I suppose, was the end of the 20th century with the anti-globalization movement. And what happened at that time was, I think it was in Mexico, a number of people were, suggesting that the global economic system was unfair. Many developing countries were not benefiting from the rules of the game at that point in time. And that preceded what was Occupy movement that happened in North America and to a certain extent in Europe, where people were raising an alarm. I suppose what they were calling themselves the 99%, raising an alarm about the growing inequities that we were seeing, where more wealth was accumulating amongst the financial class and moneyed financiers throughout the world, but particularly in countries in the Northern Hemisphere. And this phenomenon also sort of transcended geography. So we had the experience of the pink tide, what was called the pink tide movement in Latin America, where there were a number of indigenous rural workers, urban class workers, and so on, joining together to challenge the very unequal system in Latin America. And Latin America remains the region with the most unequal distribution of economic resources in the world. And we saw leaders like, although much maligned today, the sort of rise of leaders like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales. In fact, Bolivia is the country in Latin America that is growing the fastest at the moment under what we might consider socialist government. We also have the experience, I suppose, of Black Lives Matter in the United States that is challenging a racial capitalist system where black people and black men in particular lives are being threatened and are actually being taken based on a racist system in the United States. So all these movements have one, I suppose, general concern. This is what I draw from these kinds of experiences, is cause for against the current social system and current strife to make the system work better for the rest of us, as opposed to the financial elite. In the Caribbean, we have a very interesting, I suppose, experience. And this, if you look at the blogosphere, look at cyberspace and the discussions that we have through our sort of print media and our televised media, broadcast media, there's a general sense of amnesia, or what I would consider willful forgetfulness about what the role and impact that social movements have played in our society, going back as far as the early 20th century and even before that, with slave revolts that happened throughout the Caribbean, starting with the Haitian Revolution. And that kind of misapprehension, I think, is driven by two forces, by domestic politics, where our system of governance does not make room for dissent to a certain degree, does not make room for bringing in people who are the fringes and understanding their plight, but also it's driven by an external force, an imperialism and a global economic system that suppresses any kind of popular uprising. And I think that has pervaded to a large extent in, at least for the past 20 years or so, in our education system. We have children leaving after 10 years of education who leave the education system and they have no idea of themselves, no sense of themselves, no sense of their history. And to me that is hugely concerning. And I think many people in this room have responsibility to some degree in their own families, educating themselves and educating their families, to have people understand, their children and people in their communities understand that we had a very active civil society compared to what obtains now. So that in terms of a brief introduction, I'll discuss why I'm discussing social movements, and then discuss the idea of what the developmental state and how social movements come in contact with the state in terms of its repressive nature, and labor in particular. And then I would give a sort of brief history of a brief outline of what happened in terms of industrialization, the sort of organizational strategies used by the Black Power movement, and then we discussed, I wanted to give some idea of what would the policy effects of the Black Power movement. I think at least from academic literature or even sort of popular literature, we don't, there is very little discussion about the actual concrete policies the Black Power movement advocated and lobbied for in the society and actually had an impact. And then we're going to sort of draw out some lessons, and we're going to discuss towards the end what are some of the current challenges for organizing, for bringing together disparate groups of people which the Black Power movement achieved. And then we're going to sort of discuss what is the way forward. Because I think to have a discussion like this, we need to understand, okay, from our historical experience, what can we learn, but given our current circumstances, how we can take the next step. Because we have many challenges that are driven by, unequal wealth and so on. So let's sort of get into it. So I discussed some of this already. So I wanted to highlight as well the history of revolutionary movements in the Caribbean, sort of dating back to the 18th century, the Haitian Revolution and the Haitian Revolt that upended a colonial system and placed Haiti on the pedestal as the first independent Black republic in the world. We also had experiences of slave revolts and sabotage and uprisings in Barbados, in Jamaica. We know the Baptist War that happened in Jamaica in 1831. And the labor movement in the Caribbean and in particular in Trinidad and Tobago had a great deal. We often discuss our political system and gaining independence from the point of view of the politicians and the fact that Eric Williams and all these politicians were responsible for our independence. And I want to sort of dispel that myth and that idea that the politicians were at the vanguard and everybody else sort of followed suit. It was not so. The historical record shows, and many of you probably know, that labor movement, Tubal was Butler, Uriah Butler was at the forefront of advocating for decolonization, advocating for political reforms that happened in the early 20th century. So in contrast to the idea of social movement, we have the idea that development happens and progresses when the state takes the lead in the society. So many experiences we might have heard of South Korea, of Singapore, of Taiwan, and so on, is that the state took the lead in provoking and triggering rapid industrialization. And part of what is considered sort of the ingredients for that kind of rapid industrialization is a strong government, cheap labor, low wage labor, and docile labor. And incorruptible administrative structure where politicians are basically incorruptible and where people are hired and recruited based on merit as opposed to patronage and whom they know and so on in the state sector. And this sort of developmental state idea suggests that the state has to partner with capital in order to repress labor and initiate a sort of industrialization process. As a result of which we have many of the sort of East Asian countries, promoted rapid industrialization, ended poverty, and so on. But we don't understand, I think, what causes the state to do what it does and what it in our particular context, it was not like that. I want to suggest and put on the table that it was actually as a result of social movements led by the Black Power movement that initiated an episode of rapid industrialization that happened in the 70s. So in terms of a brief history, I'm going to go through this very particularly quickly. Was that our colonial economic policy basically said that we did not need industrial policy, we did not need industrialization, and colonial authorities said that we should focus in Trinidad and Tobago on natural resources and agriculture in order for our society to develop. So that's why we had in the 1950s, we had what Lloyd Best and others called industrialization by invitation, was a system where we provided all these incentives for capital to come in and operate, and we will erect a number of manufacturing enterprises in order to address the situation of a large number of people being unemployed and living in very precarious circumstances. But that system really it struggled with a massive unemployment situation in the 1960s, early 1960s. A social order that said people who were light-skinned and were white had power in the society, and they had the economic power. So this was basically a system that said, so drawing from that economic colonial policy, people like Arthur Lewis and others came and said, we should invite foreign capitalists to come because they have the skills, they have the capital, they have expertise, and what we needed to do basically was just provide infrastructure, provide incentives, and so on for them to manufacture and export. And that would solve the problem of underdevelopment in Trinidad and Tobago. So we provided massive tax holidays, exemptions, and so on, customs duties. Many of these actual, what was called the Pioneer Ordinance in the 1950s, still are on the books. And many of these incentives actually still exist for companies to access. It is in part linked to what happened with ArcelorMittal. ArcelorMittal, at the end of the 80s, benefited from a huge number of incentives. The state wrote off its debt, basically, and instead of it being on the company's books, it ended up on the public debt accounts. So we took over ArcelorMittal's debt. We sold the facilities that ArcelorMittal ended up occupying at minuscule. It was the sort of asset value of the facilities were in the billions. We ended up selling to Mittal at the time for about $70 million. So we had many of these incentives that even happened, and the sort of economic policy still lingered on until even up to the 80s. We still have many of those things on the books. So this led to, at the end of the 60s, we had the experience where unemployment was still high, I think about 17%. And the colonial system was still the colonial order was still in place. And this led to people rising up and saying that this is not suiting our needs, and we need a new economic system that is not colonially driven. So we had NJAC starting off at the university and in communities, reaching out to communities. We had a huge number of people joining NJAC and joining the movement, comprising university students, lecturers, unemployed youth from urban areas, grassroots organizations, academics, labor unions. So it was not only unions that were involved in the Black Power movement, it was a vast number of different groups that came together and said that our society is not serving the mass group of people, and we needed to change the economic system that privileged a few in the society, mainly white at the time. And I think this thread of popular movement started since, as I mentioned, back as far as the 19th, 20th century in the Caribbean. And we can't de-link what happened in 1930s, for instance, from why the Black Power movement became the Black Power movement. So what they initiated was a sort of transformative, a transformation of the society. And they advocated for new industries, new types of employment, racial justice, and changing the commanding heights of the economy from being one that tilted more or less to multinational corporations and the merchant class. So this is to show the direct impact that George Weeks had on the Black Power movement and on economic policy. So this quote is taken from the Vanguard publication that was done by the OWTU in 1968. And he said, today, and this is representative of the society back at that time, today we are in the firm grip of the United States and US dominated agencies. Oil and sugar are both owned by foreign interests. Those were the two major industries at that time. The program of industrialization has had to depend almost entirely on the influx of foreign capital. This means that profits which are made flow out of society. So this was him making a case for, and him going around making a number of speeches and writings and publications that the society had not changed since colonial times. And we needed a shift from what was going on then when we were under colonialism, since we were now an independent country. So he said before that was that our view is that every drop of oil must be produced, every man in BP, British Petroleum, must keep his job. We, the OWTU and oil workers of Trinidad, believe we can do it. We, the government and people, can maintain production for employment and government revenue. We can't do it with a national oil company. So the idea of a national oil company was floated since the 60s. And this is how we ended up. First we had Trinidad, and then we had Petrotrin came on afterwards. And proposed that government acquire BP's assets upon reasonable compensation to BP. And this is what sort of began, one of their major plans was we needed to nationalize the oil industry and create a national oil company. So to consider some of what the strategies, and many of you I know would have had the experience of participating in this, these rallies and protests and so on. And I want to hear of your experience and what that meant for society. So there were a number of protests, mass strikes, involving all these people. For instance, there was a survey in February 26, 1970. There were 200 demonstrators that started the strike leading into Port of Spain. That had gone from 200 to 10,000, and then from 10,000 to 20,000. So the Black Power movement started as a people movement and started as a way of galvanizing people to change an economic structure and a neo-colonial economic system by bringing more local ownership, more control, and end to racist employment practices that were going on in many companies, and greater state support for what were indigenous enterprises. I mean, some of the strategies as well, popular education campaigns were done to restructure both the formal education system as well as through mass political meetings where people would learn about their culture, learn about their history, learn about Butler and so on, learn about the labor movements and the labor riots in the 30s and so on, and focus on our indigenous history and our culture. That you would, as you would probably contrast it today, we don't have that kind of organizing happening now in Trinidad and Tobago today. And we can sort of go into why that might be the case later on. So many of their proposals and demands were introduction of technical vocational institutes, life skills programs in schools, agricultural studies programs, beyond just higher wages, improved working conditions, and more jobs. So they took up, I suppose, a more holistic idea and sense of what development meant at that point in time. It was about consciousness of people. It was also about gaining formal skills and educating people to meet the needs of society as opposed to just export goods and services. So this was a quote by Weeks as well in '68 to the Prime Minister. And this is what sort of crystallized the idea of a national oil company. So he said the first blossoms of the struggle were initiated by strike action against retrenchment of British Petroleum in February 1963 and followed up during the exercises of the Miss Sophie's Oil Commission of August that year, when we pioneered the proposal for a national oil company. So at the time, British Petroleum was moving towards retrenching workers, and George Weeks and the OWTO stood up and said, we are not going to allow you to retrench workers. And what we needed to do to prevent that was we needed a national oil company, which eventually became Petrotrin in the 1990s. So this is an idea of the large amount of strike activity, lockouts, protests, and so on that happened during it was peaking during the early 70s. And later on, because things were perhaps getting a little better, they saw no need for strikes. So when we discuss the importance of foreign capital, I think at least if we think about the last two political administrations, both of them discuss and talk about how do we promote Trinidad and sell Trinidad and Tobago to foreign investors. And we need foreign investment, and we need all these kinds of things. So when the economic program is based on attracting foreign investment. In the 70s, this was not the case. So as a result of some of the actions taken by Weeks, the OWTU, sugar workers, and so on, foreign investment declined rapidly. This is basically to show you, however, we had rapid economic growth. So the idea that we need foreign investment for growth in the economy is not proven by our history. So and what we needed at that time was a large public investment program that led to high levels of growth. So to give you some idea about some of the concrete policies that they had an effect on, the increase in subsidies through state-owned enterprises, through black indigenous enterprises, tax holidays given to local companies and so on. And some of the results of that was, in 1970, telephone company Telco was nationalized after a strike that lasted, I think, more than a year. Trinidad was created through the use of BP assets. Caroni was created in 1975 through nationalization. We also had a number of technologies that were created as state enterprises. The discussion around state enterprises today is a vastly, it's poor. When we discuss state enterprises, we discuss them as inefficient, lacking capability, and so on, and that we need, the best solution is to privatize them. Which leads, I think the most recent example was the closure of Petrotrin, but also the TSTT. But the experience tells us that there was a lot of innovative activity happening at our state enterprises in the early 70s and 80s. For instance, the sugar company that became Caroni patented a piece of technology that supported the weighing of sugar, and to improve the efficiency of sugar weighing and to improve the efficiency of production. There was a coconut dehusker that was done at the Caribbean Research Industrial Organization as well, along with regular companies, I think it was the Coconut Growers Association, and patented that technology. So when we talk about state enterprises not being innovative, this was not our experience. We also had, in terms of the relationship with foreign investment, the Point Lisas Industrial Complex was created as a result of the actions of the Black Power movement. We had an iron and steel company that was created that used local labor, that utilized technologies, foreign technologies, and became an innovative type of enterprise before it was privatized at the end of the 80s. There was a focus on human capital through the John Donaldson Technical Institute, training programs done in businesses, national scholarship program was started in the 70s and so on. And we have had a number of other institutions created. Alright, so what were some of the lessons we can take and draw from the experience of the Black Power movement and its effect on our society? Social movements, I suppose, when they draw upon the strength of the collective, can drive fundamental change in the society. I think that's a major point in terms of the types of employment that was created. Yesterday, the day before, I was talking with another participant here, who talked about, we saw the banks in the 70s or late 60s were mainly white people were employed by banks. That was a massive change, just visibly what happened in terms of the racial justice and in terms of what meant in terms of type of employment practices that were going on at that time. Concerns of the labor movement and concerns of Black Power movement went beyond just wages and working conditions. It went to include issues of public goods, provision of public goods, how do we improve living standards, and how do we create an economic policy that works for working people and transform the society as a whole. However, we had the curious situation of politicians becoming very insular. So in the 70s, Williams was about to resign. At the end of the 60s, and Williams was about to resign as Prime Minister. And when we had the oil boom in 1973, he said he felt a little relieved because there were more resources available. But what happened after the Black Power movement and the uprising in February 1970 was that politicians became much closer to the merchant class at the time. And in particular, the Syrian Lebanese grouping. This is documented by Samaru, I'm trying to remember his name, the historian at UTT, about how, as a result of that, and Dennis Pantin talked about a second cabinet. The second cabinet was created as a result of Williams feeling vulnerable and threatened. And he needed to create a group of people that would be supportive of him, which included a number of business people and a number of people in the PNM at the time. And what that led was, what that sort of mirrored, I thought, was the plantations economy, where the colonial state was in cahoots with the plantation owners. And they had to do that in order to suppress and repress working people and the masses. Right, so we also had, I think, at the end of the 80s into the 90s, into the present, I think, is what has happened, is that labor unions and the kind of radical organizing that happened is no longer the case, because they retreated from communities and from community activism and community projects, community programs, community education programs. We no longer have those kinds of programs that OWTU led, as well as other unions. So that has had, I think, in terms of raising the consciousness of working people, an effect on people, you know, our communities becoming very fragmented, leading to many of the problems that we see manifested in crime, in terms of unemployment, and so on, because there was no other source from which people could gain support anymore. All right, so I want to discuss this I want to have this as a discussion now, in terms of what are some of the challenges. These are some of the challenges I see that we have today, and manifest in a number of ways. We have an educated people who have benefited from education and free education, tertiary education as well, who, in my view, leave secondary school, leave tertiary education actually quite uneducated. They have very little sense of their history, very little sense of their culture. There is interest in how do I and me, you know, benefit, and how do I put me first in front of everything else. There's no collective sort of consciousness we have today as we had back then. And I want to put that on the table as one of the problems that is directly linked, I think, to how our education system has evolved. So we have issues of divided communities. There are people who live in communities who do not know their neighbor. We have from the late 80s, we've had the rise of gated communities. And we have, as a result of that, people divided by social class, by education, by where they live. So we have hotspots and we have everybody else. And I think that has led to a huge number of problems for obvious reasons. We just don't understand each other at one level, but also it has happened as a result of direct state policy on one end, but also how certain groups of people have benefited from the largesse that has flowed through the country over the last 30 years or so. So I want to get some of what your ideas from what I've discussed, and how do you think we can move forward, given some of these problems that I think we're experiencing today. I don't want to depress anybody. I think we have huge numbers of huge problems, but we also there is hope in the sense that if we become conscious of these problems, we can start working on them. And we can start thinking outside of ourselves to think about how collectively we can work together to solve some of the problems we have today. So it's open now for any sort of ideas you want to throw out, and could we think about what's going on now in comparison to what we had in our history.
I just want to make a comment
about
the Black Power movement. Because of the NCHAC, from growing up and my mother being a member of that movement, what I noticed, I hear you talk about people, I can't remember what you say, but anyway, in the banks, yeah. They only had white people in the bank. They only had white people on the plane as flight attendants. And I remember we used to have a carnival in Arima in the tennis court. And they used to call it White People Carnival. And you couldn't go inside there. And after the Black Power movement and all that took place, all these things stopped. As I will tell flight attendants when I go on a plane. You know, I'll tell them about the history of this thing, or they couldn't work on a plane. Now they could work on a plane, you know, because, and they themselves don't know about that, you know. So I think there's a whole kind of re-education of the people, and you have to start from the school and start small. Because if you notice with all these terrorist gangs and all that, who they teaching first is the little children. So that we had to take that pattern and start training and teaching small children from the time they're small and they could hear. Because just yesterday I was speaking about how children get it now. But what happened now? Parents do things in front of children thinking they don't have sense. You know, they wouldn't understand what's going on. And they're watching and they're understanding everything that's going on. And that's how they're coming out how they are today. And so that I am saying we need to teach children, not to come when they don't get big already, teach them from primary school onwards. Let them know, have a little session on social studies or something. And these are the things they should be teaching children. I don't know what they're teaching them in school now. Because I don't have no little children. I have grandchildren who big and leave school. So I just wanted to mention that.
Said something in the political process in the example 200 people.
And again,
Those days we have social media.
I don't hear what he said.
He said that when they started off protesting, there were like a couple hundred people. But when they started growing to tens and thousands of people, that was not based on social media.
No. Yes.
So now we have social media, technically children actually live on it. And find out why or something. Let's move on to the social. And you gotta find some way to generate history or create some kind of formula or algorithm to get this kind of information that show what was in the past and what have us where we are at this point in time. And the sacrifices were made in the past not give you the right to have a smartphone, because if you think about it, it's like 5 or 50 or 20 years ago, we used to use these normal generic phones, and when the market was open up for all these different phone companies engaged in Trinidad, then we had these smartphones and all these different things. So we had to find a way to actually reach that ignorant, I would say ignorant, if I could use that audience, because they don't know what happened in the past. I am all known exactly what happened. I was born, I just tried to just read and get information. Knowing what my parents went through, I try now to impart on my kids, and not everybody tries to do that.
And another thing is that to me, like, In the days when they had NJAC focused on education. The boys on the block, they wanted education. Now people don't want education. You know, you will fight and because I represent low income workers, workers on the ground, the lowest workers you could think about. And they're not really interested in no education, you know. It's like I had to force and beg certain people to come and educate themselves because you know what they'll say? They want to bring the children to you educate yourself and let your children follow and let them see what you trying to uplift yourself, you know. So these is the kind of problems and challenges we have to face and how we overcome them. I don't know. I hope somebody could say something in the room here. Yeah.
So the issue of crime. I mean, we talk about crime in this very, I think, very narrow way about there is a group of bad people, and that group of bad people is causing the suffering of the rest of us. But when we don't talk about education system and the fact that it is not suited for people with different kinds of abilities or even for raising consciousness of people. What do we use our community centers for is another question we have, and it is directly linked, if we think about it, directly linked to what I can call the contractariat. These are the group of people who only bid for contracts and access government revenues, access resources, and basically add very little value to the society. So, if we talk about the number of community centers just as one example, those things were built because politicians saw the need of offering contracts to people as a kickback. It was not built in a holistic sense of how do we use these centers to educate people. I mean, there is some activity in some community centers where senior citizens come to activities, you have cooking classes and so on. But there isn't enough of those kinds of things that go on to bring people together. Now everybody, because of the crime situation, they leave work or whatever, they go home. There is very little in terms of other things that can be done that say that we can bring people together.
I think in the community center because they separate people in the community.
Yeah.
When it comes to the community center, if PNM in power, PNM could use it. If UNC in power, UNC could use it. You know, and that is how they control people in the community. And they don't have the idea, they don't know what's going on. People just want to argue about all kind of stupidness, but they don't want to educate themselves. You know, they must have community centers more accessible to the people in the community. You know, because I could remember I did a lot of classes at my home just to accommodate people. And now I have a community center, you can't go in it. You know, the same work I want to do because if I go there, they feel I want to be a politician. You know, people think up all kind of funny things in their mind when they see you trying to help people. Don't help people. Leave them where they is. I'm telling you from experience. Because people always afraid of me in my community because they feel I on some political agenda. And I have been doing my work for years and up to now I join a party and work for election.
Being an activist is a political thing.
But I know it's political work, but not party politics.
Yeah, it's definitely not party politics. It's just very interesting how we kind of talk about politics as a PNM UNC thing as opposed to a people thing. It's very, it's mind-boggling. Anyway, go ahead.
Based on I think you mentioned industrialization by implication. So, and at one point in time, you highlighted some of that. All right. So my question is, did we really learn from this example and with regards to country and trade union membership, etc., how we really learn and assess the situation? Because way back from the historical aspect of it till now, we really learn and understand what that industrialization by invitation does to our nation with regards to we want to get them involved as financiers, if I can say that, right? And then after, when the exit, I say, the nation have to deal with what situation or whatever circumstances arise and that. So my thing is, did we really learn as a nation and what we doing now from this point to go forward to not repeat this form of industrialization, like and so if we get involved in it, it truly benefit the country and the nation and the people around.
I think that the discussion around the NAR is important. It's linked to what you're saying. Many economists, when they discuss the time the NAR came into government, they discuss that as a positive period in the country's history. And I tend to think it was not. For the reason that we did have an economic crisis in the 80s, but that crisis was not triggered as a result of bad spending. That's often what you hear. That we have an economic recession or crisis because there was profligacy that happened and bad spending and massive projects and that will waste the time and so on and so on and so on. And then the NAR had to come and cut the spending and all of that. So ArcelorMittal is a direct outcome of the actions taken both in the NAR at the end of the 80s and the PNM at the beginning of the 90s. The decision was taken in 1989 to lease the steel company and sell it basically for pittance after spending over, I think about $1.2 billion in 1989. What that is today, we sold the company for $70 million. That was leased to Metal, the Indian company. And in 1993, it was completely privatized by the Patrick Mining administration. And that led, and as a result of a lot of decisions taken from the 90s onwards, the deregulation of capital, the opening up of banks to increase foreign ownership, and all these kinds of things, trade, opening up of trade, led to what we had in 2016. Was ArcelorMittal could say there is no obligation to the society after making billions and billions of dollars. There is no obligations in society because you have flexible working conditions and so on. So you could just completely retrench people. There's no obligation. You don't pay anything in taxes as a result. You don't pay severance benefits. You don't pay workers anything. So we need, I think, linking what has happened in our history is important to understand what's going on now. And I think that's the major point to make. All the decisions taken lead back to that period of time, what happened with ArcelorMittal. The floor is open. You have a question or comment?
I have a comment. In relation to the comrades' submission about persons not wanting education. And I felt as though the education system in Trinidad and Tobago, it didn't season the students for real life. We were sold this dream, at least I was sold this dream in school, that if I go to school, I'll come out and I'll get a good job and I'll have a good standard of living. And I believed that up until I entered the workforce. And that's what it did. It sold some dreams. I don't know who controlled the education system, but it was kind of whitewashed, because I believe I was telling you yesterday, Dr. Perry, in high school I didn't learn anything about the Black Power movement. Or at least I can't remember, and I left school about 10 years ago. I didn't learn anything about the Black Power movement. I didn't know all of this. I was exposed to it outside of academia, outside of the structure of the school system. And you also made a comment about the crime situation. And a lot of these criminals or community leaders, they are public figures in their circles, they are public figures in their communities. So they are criminals in the media, but they help the grassroots persons in their communities, you understand? They are seen as positive figures, and the young people are looking at them. So on one end we have this whitewash system that doesn't teach young people about their history, and we have these criminals who become public figures. I mean, in the mind of this impressionable youth, you could see where the society is going, right? So I probably am asking you, what could we do to reform the education system, or even reform the minds of the impressionable youth? I mean, they are only exposed to this. I am a graduate, and I don't live the kind of life that I see Dole living. They were putting gold in his coffin and money in his coffin, and I'm sending out hundreds of resumes to get a job, and he was probably catching goldfish, but I am trying to catch goldfish as well. How do I do that? How do we reform the education system and reform the culture of the community?
My name is Risa, I'm international workers. And I want to make I'm sorry I'm back and forth, I would like to stay like somebody else. Education system. How many people here are familiar with the UCAM system?
What do you know about
UCAM. I recently did an interview with a former director. Let me tell you what that UCAM system did. Remember the context in which you're speaking. A lot of people would go to the army. A certain, all the public utilities, workers of a generation told me this. TNTEC, TST, WASA, all those public utilities, those guys graduated from the camp, they were short of a job because they did the manual arts. And, you know, as you were saying, it was not a one-size-fits-all system. You know, this guy, you know, Benjamin, you know his song? After that, when he same thing over and over, that was the they gave them column for a whole week. And Benjamin make up a song in the camp. I said, the same thing over and he's a big superstar. They went into the army, they went into the Coast Guard, and until I didn't go on directors. The point being, education served them. They did not serve education. And it's the same context in which we are speaking. Who matters? People or the program? Those youngsters, they might be rebelling. They're not stupid. They are telling us this thing does not work for us. This is not working for us. Now on the other side, you define success in terms of all the bling. You tell me inclusion is a car. So if I cannot get it here, through your methodology, your educational methodology, and success is still defined in terms of, you know, star, this post, this whatever, am I not going to naturally make a try? And then you tune on me, and we are where we are today. So, my point is, unless these institutions serve these youngsters' needs, and this did not, a silly person does not rebel when he accepts. Somebody who is in pain strikes out, is what this generation is telling us, this thing about pain. And we call them what? This and that.
gangs?
Yeah. And he's making a point. Young culture fills a certain need.
A need that both the state and both civil societies need to.
Many times I'm in environment I hear people talk. I go up to them and say, you ever spend on 19 cigarettes? I never. I've been around the YTC. Some people have been in prison. I've been part of an outreach program for a sports company up there 78 years. I do not know anything about YTC. I never spent a night in it. I never spent a thing. There are young men in there. They're waiting for a trial, need 7 and 8 years. What's my point? If we do not look at the institutions in the environment, same point I suspect Dr. Perry is making, that 1970 was an effort to create from below institutional change. And interesting, I was in a forum next door. That took place, but it has not been consolidated. It has not been. The trade union was in the vanguard for meaningful change, but the trade union as a vehicle per se has limitations. Its primary concern is the workers. The trade union has to be a much broader social unit. OWTU had that characteristic under the leadership of George Weeks. That is why the father of the anti-apartheid movement in this country was OWTU.
Something is said here just now, and I'm thinking, when you refer to trade union, if you ask average trade unionists to define industrial relations, do you think they can do it? Because if they do, that statement you just made, you recognize it's erroneous. Because the trade union movement has a mandate to protect the rights and promote the interests of its membership. And the very definition of industrial relations take into account occurrences inside and outside of the work environment, which includes all aspects. And if you're looking after the interests of the membership, their children, their home, their community, and everything that impacts that member will be considered. But how do we come about representation? So while we beat the politicians, the trade unions replicate the same political model.
Yeah, correct.
And the key point in this is that post George Weeks Jr. and Nunez, I'm just calling some names. Remember these trade unions, their character changed to a large extent. You didn't need anything. That willingness to go out there and fight in the street, a lot of them became bureaucratic. I always remind people, workers in this country, Sierra James, Walter Rodney, George Sammy, all these known intellectuals, well-respected people, Maurice Bishop. This second-rank leadership would sit down across them from a table like how we are. So that whole perspective was that awareness, building that awareness, your identity, your role in the society. Remember, and I imagine you would have touched on the call for nationalization of the oil industry came from where? Within the. So imagine today that technology can run the own oil industry. From 1937. Yes, we can, you know. But, you know, I mean, sorry, I'm kind of cutting here, but I come back to the point of education. Education making people aware and conscious. And it transcends what is in the classroom. What is in the classroom codifies what exists in the wider society. And until we ask ourselves, what is the relationship between education, production, culture, and social development? We have a problem. Why is it we do not say in some organized environments, 10 years down the road, you're going to need X number of doctors, X number of engineers. Therefore, the priority in the university is, that is the faculty we're going to grant. Finance could take a backup because we have to build the society. Why do we not? And you know as a result of that, how we do that? We have to import people. Come on, we build Trinidad, build Churchill, Roosevelt, the highway. When was your driver build? That can't match up. We build Rice Road. Local workers build, it used to be FedCam in Yara. Local workers build that. There's a famous, I forget the name now. Build Mosquito Creek, Chinese didn't build that. Buildings will fall down in Trinidad. So what it is that we have been told that we can't do it. And I came back and I just on the map. Education has to give us a perspective and approach. This is what our country needs in the next 10 years. This is the resource base. This is how we have to organize it. And until leadership has that kind of vision, we'll be experiencing the what? One shot, one kill, wrong name of time.
While I'm here, a lot of day and solutions that are outside of us. And for me, that's where the answer lies. You hear about we wouldn't allow what made us different from those who we put in office. Why we said we are responsible for putting them there. Was the criteria we using to put them there? So we have to take ownership of the issue here. I know you see you visited YPC, but I would have worked there, I spent 24 years in the system. And I'm saying to us, until we look at access to opportunity, access to justice, we look at altered destiny, why the working class child has to wonder if he's going to school, the other class contemplates where they're going. We talk about what we inculcated in our children. What are we inculcated in the neighbor's child? A lot of us, our child is not the neighbor child because, and we don't understand the very child that we try to isolate and alienate from our own is creating the environment for our children, our families to survive in. I don't know what community you came from. I know the community center in Tanapuna, I can tell you. I closed off a children's camp here yesterday, having run that camp in 3 weeks to facilitate parents who are working and children who are poorly or not supervised. It takes the initiative of you, me. Problem starts with us. We didn't wake up today and find society the way it is. We contributed, as I told them yesterday in the camp. If we are born criminals, then vote among them now and kill them one time, save the taxpayers' money. Criminals are not born, they are made. And we must ask ourselves, how did we contribute? My mother couldn't read and write. And most of life lessons that I am living today, I was taught by her.
Yes.
So we hear education, and all I'm thinking is certification.
Right.
Because we have some people who are brighter than those who are holding a piece of paper.
Yes.
Yes, and while we diagnose it, I would like to hear us diagnose. How am I helping or hurting? How am I solving or contributing? Am I strategically placed in my own mindset to start to interact with my neighbor? I heard you said something and I said, ouch. I'm in a circle with 13 and other households. And if you ask me for direction to one of them, hardly like to tell you. That's something I know I need to fix, and that's why I'm always introspective. I really don't know my neighbors because I'm always busy outside doing something. But what am I saying to us? When you see the young man with his pants under his butt, what do? We talk about it and we don't talk to it. And I'm telling you, these people, they take correction. As a matter of fact, when you ignore them, you tell them, I don't care. One young man is on community service and he opted to do his community service serving in the camp. He was given an award yesterday because we tend to throw people away. We have a graduate from YP that's a doctor, takes on his doctoral degree. He started his studies right here in Cipriani College, with the prison having to bring him to class. He went home on an early conditional release, and he completed his master's before me at Atalanta. How are we facilitating the opportunities for persons to change and be given access to opportunities? What I really want to hear in our discussion, what are we going to do? And when we decide what we're going to do, we can impact those who are doing it, they're not doing it correctly. But here what we do, we put our friends because we like them.
Yeah.
We vote for somebody else because of the color, the texture of their hair, and what they can do for us. Come on, let's keep it real.
Yeah.
Because if you vote for somebody and you want something, but I voted for you. We have to get to that point of consciousness. What can I do
But at the
to help?
end of the day, when we do vote for them, they're not actually serving our needs. They're not serving our needs, they're serving the people who are financing them. And more than that, I mean, I don't want to be too political, but I mean, it's just in my nature. At the present time we live in, we are at a point where the finance people, we were in a recession for the past 10 years. If you check the books of the banks and what the profits that banks have made over the past 10 years, and you think about who owns the banks and the relationship between the owners of the banks and the politicians, and we started to drill down on where our problems really lie in terms of our politics and why certain decisions are taken. I always bring up the example of the first policy decision that was taken by this government was to reduce the life of the vehicles, the foreign use vehicles. And what that decision was linked to was the big showroom that was opened up in Chabonas. And who owned that showroom? And some car. So I mean, these are things that we really need to start thinking about how decisions are taken and what decisions are not taken and how that actually is linked to how our politics is organized and who is actually the financiers and the financial elites who hold the power and yield the power in our society.
I want you to tackle that because I want us now to think within our own mindset. How could we behave in a way that signals our disgust with such a decision? Because plenty of us, driving a PCB and it's working well, it's working right, nothing wrong with it. Do we need to acquire a vehicle from? With me? Do we need it? We had somebody go on television, and that's how we came with the 1% conversation, right? They said, you know what he did after when the country was uproar about the statement? He kept us safe, and we had traffic back up in Quebec for hours. It took me to get from Piaco to Cipriani because he knows we wanted to push. So the very people who were disgusted with international comment flooded the gates to get a sail to save a plane. Our consciousness. There are two stores I don't patronize. His and I am where the body was found and the police were restricted from going, but they can kick in the back door of somebody to get the incidents. So I don't patronize IAM. And I wish everybody could think like that. So you hit them where it hurts most, where? In the pocket. But most of us want the sale. So we went by, how can you name this store? More Alive. More Alive. Traffic back up. Back to the up. With poor people holding onto the wire, waiting for the turn to go into spec. Understand what I'm saying? We have to understand we are fueling this. And until we understand that, we just be talking.
Yeah, one last, I don't mean important, but this is so important and interesting. I have a mantra. Make a difference where you are. some of us, we always look right to the top. Yeah, we'll get there. Remember, but we're starting with an idea of belief and of faith. If you're in PTA, make a difference. If you are in a village council, make a difference. If you're in a trade union, make a difference. Make a difference where you are. It will grow and will coalesce, and you're going to find people with like minds. A lot of us look at the big picture and say, oh my God, election. I'm saying, make a difference in your PTA. Make a difference in your key senior community. Make a difference in your trade. Make a difference in your sports club. Make a difference in your singing group. Okay? If there's an issue in your community, get involved. No, as I say, Butler did not start with paranormal building. Grew up with a cane, a Bible, and a belief that we could make a difference. Joe Young did not start with two building. He told us in an interview, he and George used to ride the bus and they would be planning. So I'm saying, I was in another environment, people were talking about hope and so. You can look at the situation two ways: despair or defining the work that has to be done. But again, I am suggesting make a difference where you are. That's why we're here. It's not about us, but everybody in this room feels it, is feeling it. And we feel we can make a change. I'm saying we have taken the first step, and we have to keep stepping.
Right, so we just want to say thank you. Alright, and each comrade or cooperator will say that this was a very edifying session, yes, and not straight from the topic with regards to the industrial change. So we always have to focus on what happened, to see where we are right now, and what is required for us to move forward. Good? So we have to not just think that change is inevitable, but it should be holistic. Good? Holistic in the sense that from all points of view, economic, social, within itself. Alright? So we just want to end, as we have heard, that we want to leave here today and we want to say to ourselves, how can we solve? Right? How can we contribute? Alright? So, noting our comrades ending comments. Alright? So let us all start to look from within ourselves and use examples from our past and our present to develop that inevitable way of life we want to achieve, way forward for our nation as a whole. Alright? And start with your cane, start with your Bible. So thank you for attending the session.